Good morning, folks. It is September the 2nd, 2021, in the midst of this pathological nightmare of an election. And I have some thoughts to share with you based on an article that Selley wrote in the National Post, published today. Anti-Trudeau protests are ugly, but hardly surprising or unprecedented. Calling the anti-vaccine, anti-mask, and anti-lockdown crowd deplorables and enemies of society is unlikely to speed along the process of changing their minds. Campaign protests are nothing new, but veteran reporters say these are angrier this time than in recent memory. Surely, though, that's unsurprising. Over the last 18 months, your average Canadian has had a lot more to be angry about than in recent memory. Most of it wasn't the government's fault, if it was anyone's, but if the federal government is going to call an election solely on behalf of the Prime Minister's ego, then it should expect an earful. But she got something wrong in her assessment of our government's culpability and the current hashtag COVID-1984 crisis and its enormous cost in human life and resources. An investigative journalist should know better than to state it wasn't the fault of the federal government. From CBC News. O'Toole wants an investigation of Winnipeg virus lab ties to China. 2 scientists were fired after shipping samples of highly contagious pathogens to Wuhan. Written by John Paul Tasker in CBC News, posted on June the 1st of this year. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole is demanding the Public Health Agency of Canada release documents that detail the relationship between Canada's National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, an ill-fated partnership that resulted in 2 scientists being removed from the Winnipeg lab after they shipped samples of Ebola and Henipavirus to the lab in China. As CBC first reported in 2019, Dr. Jianguo Cui, her husband Keding Cheng, and a number of her students from China were escorted from Canada's only level 4 lab after one of them shipped samples of highly contagious pathogens to Wuhan. Level 4 labs are built to work with extremely infectious pathogens that, if released, could cause immense damage. Cui was head of the vaccine development and antiviral therapy section in the special pathogens program at the lab. PHAC has referred the matter to the RCMP, and Cui and Cheng were fired this past January. Well, folks, that doesn't sound like a lack of culpability to me. We see a consistent theme in the legacy media of refusing to investigate anything that places the government in a negative light. If this story conveys accurately the relationship between Winnipeg's Level 4 biopathogen laboratory and Wuhan's doppelganger lab, our government has cooperated with the CCP to globally launch a bioweapon against the entire world. Words fail to describe how heinous and perverse such a crime against humanity is. It is an act of sheer diabolical evil, and one that has permanently altered our way of life, replete with soul-crushing attacks against our civil liberties that have accompanied our government's failed attempts to mitigate a crisis they have assisted in causing. Any investigative journalist ought to have done their research and defined with clarity why we are in the midst of a campaign where our leading narcissists are promising to double down on every single policy which has brought us to the very brink of ruin. Human behavior is remarkable for its propensity to double down on habits that are literally suicidal. We have a neighbor at our trailer's seasonal site who is a lovely woman. Sadly, she is dying of heart and lung failure, but continues to smoke like a chimney. Only human beings repeat behavior that causes their own destruction, which is why we have limited constitutional government. Our ancestors, with all their faults, or perhaps because they were aware of their faults, have bequeathed us a system of governance that recognizes man's inherent self-destructive and narcissistic nature. There will always be psychopaths among us who seek to use the full force of the state to control others and dictate how we are not only to live, but to think. You will note the current government mishandles the nation because it chooses to ignore constitutional law. Sadly, law enforcement and the courts have been politicized to the point where they refuse to enforce the constitutional limits on government. That is bad enough. But it is far, far worse. It is the enormous number of Canadians who approve of the government exceeding its legal authority to govern. And no election can fix that. No political party, no matter how well-intentioned and principled, can remedy the fact that a large percentage of Canadians have come to believe in very dangerous and pathological things. They are ideologically possessed and driven by magical thinking. This leaves them completely ready, willing, and able to double down on every failed policy that can only result in Canada's ruin. And a little thought from our dear friend Sting, from the Demolition Man, with apologies to him. Trudeau is a walking nightmare, an arsenal of doom. He can kill a conversation when he walks into a room. He's a three-line whip. He's the sort of thing they ban. He's a walking disaster, boy. A Demolition Man. Minute, 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 minute.